Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this brief presentation on the American Revolution. In this presentation, we'll be focusing on causes of the American Revolution, and I'll be introducing those causes in a very brief way, and in future presentations, I'll go into more significant details. So hold on and enjoy the ride. This slide is about the big picture causes of the American Revolution. You see here we have the economic causes that we're going to discuss, which we should all be familiar with, things like mercantilism. That's one of the things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the social and cultural causes. Sometimes that's also known as socio-cultural. We're also going to talk about the political causes and the intellectual causes. This is the big picture, big idea slide, and I'm going to break each of these things down as we move forward. Now let's discuss some more specific details about the causes of the American Revolution. We already talked about the big picture causes as we saw in the previous slide there. But right now I just want to introduce to you some more specific causes of this rather epic revolution. First off, we want to make sure we understand that there were tons of acts passed by the British, and those acts caused a lot of problems for American colonists, so we need to understand what those are. This concept of salutary neglect was also very, very important and is also connected to acts passed by the British previously. We're also going to discuss mercantilism, which was the economic system of the American colonies and of Great Britain, the parent country. This is going to be very, very key that we understand that concept going forward. Of course, there's the Enlightenment, my favorite subject. We'll talk about that in a later presentation, along with the Great Awakening, the Boston Massacre, and the French and Indian War. These four causes over here will be the subject of a subsequent presentation, and for now we're going to focus on these three right here. Mercantilism is an economic system. I cannot possibly, as a U.S. history teacher, overemphasize the importance of mercantilism on the development of the American colonies and the eventual Revolutionary War that we would fight. Okay, I cannot possibly overemphasize this enough. Mercantilism is essential for every U.S. history student to understand. Okay, let me tell you why. Because if you don't understand the economic system we started with, you will not understand the significance of when we change over to the free market or the free enterprise, the capitalist system that was championed by Adam Smith in 1776. So it is essential that you understand mercantilism for the American Revolution and for America's economic future. But it's also a key reason why we told British to get the heck out in the first place, because they were cutting in on our action. You know, it was not good times. They were taking our stuff. Because mercantilism is an economic system that is all about the mother country. Okay, the goal is to make money for the mother country. How do we do that? They hoard gold and silver that they get from the colonies, or they get from selling stuff to the colonies, and they export way more than they import. Who suffers? The colonies. Okay? This entire system was designed to help the mother country get filthy, stinking rich. All right? And the Navigation Acts were passed to support and enforce mercantilism. And that's what we're going to talk about in our next slide. We're going to go into some detail about the Navigation Acts, because it's important to understand how serious they were, the mother country that is, about making sure that their little gold mine was protected. And it was a big, big problem for the American colonists. And right up until the war breaks out between Britain and the American colonies, this is going to be a major, major problem for both parties. Now that we've talked about mercantilism, let's talk about the acts that British Parliament passed in order to support this economic system. Now, as you can see, there are tons of acts here. The British were very, very busy people. We don't have time in this presentation to talk about every single one of these. So we're going to focus on, for this presentation, we're going to focus on the Navigation Acts, which were the earliest acts passed by the British to support mercantilism. We're going to talk about the Sugar and Molasses Act of 1733 and also the Sugar Act of 1763. So we're going to focus on those few acts so that we can really understand what was going on there. So now let me bring up my other graphic, and let me show you some details about these acts. So we have the Navigation Acts. Now, we're going to focus on three. There were several more Navigation Acts that we could talk about, but for time's sake, let's focus on just these three. We have the 1651 Act, we have the Act from 1660, and the Act from 1696. The Act in 1661 was aimed at the Dutch. At this point, Britain and the Dutch are engaged in intense competition for trade and for making money, and so the English thought, let's pass an act that's going to keep the Dutch from cutting in on our colonial action. So they said that only goods from English ships could be imported to the colonies. That was the key component of the act that we need to care about. It didn't work. Actually, it was massively unsuccessful. The Dutch made tons of money off of it, and now we get the development of the black market in the colonies, because people were just engaging in smuggling and getting around the act, basically ignoring it. So in 1660, the British are like, well, listen, the 1651 Act is just not getting it done. Let's just pass it again, So they pass it again, and then they added additional goods that were included in the first act to the Act of 1660. So they said, let's try this again, and we'll just add more goods, right? Let's just add more. Okay, so they think that's going to fix the problem, it's going to solve it. But no, it's not what fixes it, because in 1696, they pass an additional act to try to close the loopholes and strengthen enforcement. All three of these acts were an epic failure for the British, and the Dutch made out like bandits with it. And so let's move on to the Sugar and Molasses Act of 1733, which was their next attempt to try to control trade in the colonies and prevent imports from foreign nations getting in there. So what this was, it was a tax on molasses, sugar, and rum imports to the colonies. So they wanted to prevent the foreign countries from being able to make money from their colonies. That also was not very successful because they had to pass another one in 1764. Are you noticing a pattern here? This act in 1764 taxed additional products and extended and modified the previous act from 1733. So as we move forward, I'll get into more details about the other acts, but I wanted to make sure that you had a good understanding of the Sugar Act of 1764, Sugar and Molasses Act of 1733, and the three Navigation Acts of 1651, 1660, and 1696. On this slide, we're going to talk about the policy of salutary neglect. Salutary neglect. This is the idea of benign neglect. Benign meaning not bad, not malevolent. It's kind of a neutral, not a big deal kind of deal. But what the British did, they basically left the colonies alone. They just didn't pay much attention to them for a long, long time. Most of the colony's history, in fact, they just left them alone. As long as they were shipping raw materials and as long as they were doing what the mother country wanted them to do, they pretty much let them do whatever they want. So the colonists got used to this. If you just let people do whatever it is that they want, they get used to being able to do that, to having that freedom. So when the colonists, created these things like look at New England here, town meetings, citizen participation, right, direct democracy, these ideas, these happenings that were occurring in New England were really giving the people the ability to take care of themselves. It was showing them they really didn't need England to be at their beck and call and take care of every little thing. The colonists were becoming self-sufficient, and that is important to remember. And New England wasn't the only colony where this was happening. This was happening in the 1600s in Virginia with the House of Burgesses. They had elected representatives, okay? They had, in the House of Burgesses, they had a representative democracy. So this idea of self-government was not brand new for the colonists. This is something that they've been practicing for the English colonists almost since they got to the New World. And once Britain realized that this was a problem, they started to realize this was a problem in the 1700s because the colonists weren't following all their orders. They were boycotting, they were ignoring the laws, and they were just doing what they wanted to do because they had been allowed to do whatever they wanted for so long. So this process of salutary neglect, the British realized a bit too late this was a bad idea. And once they tried to enforce their policies hardcore, that's when you get all those acts by the British that you see that we went over earlier in this presentation. They started passing all these acts to try to control the colonists. But unbeknownst to them, they had already passed the point of no return. The colonists had gotten used to governing themselves, to handling their own affairs, and they no longer wanted British interference. They realized they really didn't need Britain to protect them or control them. And so this policy of salutary neglect, because basically the Brits got lazy and didn't really care much about the colonies, they weren't really thinking about it. I mean, to be fair, they were kind of busy with things like the English Civil War. They were beating each other up. They didn't have time to deal with the colonies. But that act of benign neglect was a direct cause of the Revolutionary War, because it's what gave the colonists the impetus to throw Britain off in the first place. All right, ladies and gentlemen, on this slide, we're going to take a look at this rather fantastic graphic that I found online. Below here, you see the website where I got it from. There's a teacher who did this. This is fantastic. It's far beyond my capabilities, and I always want to cite my sources, and I just wanted to give a shout out to that person because this is a great, great graphic. So let's get into the nitty-gritty details of this. Let me make this bigger so you can really see the first half of it here. All right, so here at the top, we see mercantilism, which, of course, was England's economic goal. Mercantilism is an economic system. It's important we remember that. And what I really like about this graphic is the details it gives about salutary neglect. You see, this is the starting point here. It goes all the way till 1763. So that is a really nice visual, so you can get a sense of just how pervasive, how long this policy lasted. And it really had a huge, huge impact on America's desire to rebel and overthrow English rule. You see the Navigation Acts are mentioned. Of course, my favorite topic, the Enlightenment. We've got the Molasses Act, the Albany Congress we haven't talked about yet, but we will. We have the height of the Great Awakening, which all of you should be intimately familiar with at this point. French and Indian War, Proclamation of 1763, which was a result of the French and Indian War. So groups that are assigned the French and Indian War, you need to pay particular attention to this proclamation. Let's take a look at the other half. All right, here we go. Now it gets into some nice nitty-gritty details here. Okay, so now we have the Stamp Act, and that directly leads to the Stamp Act Congress. So groups one have the Stamp Act. You need to pay particular attention to that. We have the Sugar Act, Boston Massacre, the Gaspee Incident. I haven't talked about that, but we will. The Tea Act, the Coercive Acts, which brings us to the First Continental Congress, and then we have, this is really important, the Adam Smith publishing The Wealth of Nations. If you really want to understand the economic system that America eventually developed, you need to understand Adam Smith. This is where we get capitalism. This is where we have the beginnings of that economic shift that I've talked about before, where we go from mercantilism to capitalism, to the free market, free enterprise. So I want you to keep this date in mind, not just because it's a Declaration of Independence, but also because Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. This was hugely influential on our founding fathers, and it really helped them figure out how to develop the economic system that they did. So what did we learn? We learned that there are four big picture causes to the American Revolution. We learned that there are intellectual causes, political causes, economic causes, and social and cultural causes. Remember, that's also known as sociocultural. We learned that there were several specific causes to the American Revolution: mercantilism, acts passed by the British, salutary neglect, the Enlightenment, the Great Awakening, the French and Indian War, and the Boston Massacre. We went through a timeline of several key events leading up to the Revolution, and we learned it's essential to understand the transition from mercantilism to capitalism. We learned that we need to focus on that. The specific acts we discussed were the Navigation Acts, three key ones: the Sugar and Molasses Act and the Sugar Act. And what I want you folks, my students, to keep in mind as we move forward, I want you to think about what the specific causes were and which of the big picture causes they fall under. So I want you to match mercantilism with one of these big picture causes and match acts passed by the British to one of these big picture causes. I want you to think about that as we go forward, and I'd like to have a class discussion about it. I hope this presentation was useful for you, and I hope to see you in the next video.